This is Jack Self for Real Review.
And I'm Bryan Wolff for Real Review.
Where would you like to begin today, Brian?
We wanted to record this podcast to give everyone an update on the upcoming issue 18, um, but also use that as a way to speak about a bit of a broader topic. Mainly because I think the big update on issue 18 is that it is delayed, as members have maybe already heard through the group chat. And the main reason for that is that we have been moving printers while also reorganizing Real Review. And while initially that seemed to be much smoother than anticipated, it actually turned out to be exactly as anticipated, because moving printers, as you mentioned, Jack, at some point, is like moving a family of four. It's something you ideally only do once or twice in a lifetime. Yeah, so maybe, Jack, you want to talk a bit about, well, let's first talk about what happened with this move to printer and what it has meant. And then we can maybe extrapolate from that a bit broader about the state of printing in at least within Europe, and when it pertains to a magazine like ours.
Mm. And I would also like to talk about kind of independent publishing generally across Europe. Um, yeah, I mean it's a fairly straightforward story. We had a lot of limitations in the UK post Brexit. One of them was unless we were willing to buy literally thousands of kilos of paper in one go, it was not possible anymore for us to get more than one pallet. So we had to artificially reduce the amount that we printed Real Review after Brexit. So this is after I think January 31, 2021. I think that's when we formally left. So our print run had to drop from, I think at that point it was about 5,000 down to 3,000. That was the most that we could print, because we couldn't afford to buy and hold enough paper to print more. So that obviously had like a big financial impact on the magazine. The other issue we had was like also associated with Brexit, a number of medium-sized printers went bankrupt or closed, I mean, most of them were absorbed by larger printers. So the types of printers for something like Real Review, Real Review is not, and we'll talk about this later, but Real Review is not like an independent magazine doing 300 copies for like central Glasgow. It's also not, a large scale, glossy magazine, even if it's independent, but in a more mainstream media landscape where it's printing 30,000, 40,000 copies. It sits in that middle range of like basically 3 to 12,000 is kind of the middle range for circulation. Once you crack 10,000, you start to be in a different economic ball game. People take that differently. But yeah, basically we had a lot of difficulty in terms of securing paper. Our original printer, Push, went bankrupt. Well, sorry, they didn't go bankrupt. They closed due to Brexit, and then the rump of Push Print, which really specialized in independent publications in art books, got kind of absorbed into other parts of other companies. Our print manager, Danny, stuck with us. He went independent and he used to manage it. But I think, as we've discussed before, eventually this just became very problematic because each part of the print process was being done by a different company, being managed by Danny. And if there was a delay in one part, if there was a hold up with paper in customs, then we would miss our print slot, which meant then we had to reschedule for our folding and finishing, which often meant that like our bags wouldn't arrive on time. And so there was basically the whole process was more challenging. What you really want is one printer who does the whole thing from start to end, has a fixed time on it. And so eventually, we realized that the best way to do this was to move it inside the EU. That way we would no longer have the same limitations on paper supply, but also, look for one of these medium-sized printers that specialize in these types of jobs. And we did a lot of research. We talked to a lot of printers across Europe, and we found this company, INI Group, who are now going to be our new printer. And then we just had a series of like unfortunate mishaps, which is pretty normal when moving printer is really something you want to do very, very rarely, because it's like muscle memory doing a publication. Once a company knows how to do all of the little finicky bits of it, it's fine. You just keep doing it. But setting it up and making sure that you really check and get the quality and outcome that you want is not that easy. So yeah, we had a couple of setbacks. The first setback was our original print manager unfortunately left the company halfway through. So we had like gone through the process of briefing and exploration and checking and doing price quotations. And so the handover to a new print manager, it cost us a couple of weeks because this new print manager was like, I'm not up to speed with this project. Basically, you kind of have to start again a little bit. Then the second issue we had was, I think, just some strange decisions, or like not well coordinated decisions with regards to paper, because the paper that we print on is called Thin Star. It's a 60 GSM paper, so it's very lightweight, but it's a remarkable paper. It's got very high gloss, very high brightness, so it's very white, and it also has porcelain in it, so it's got low show through, so that you can print color image and you don't get a lot of that transferal onto the other side. So it's quite a specific paper, and we got the dummy back for this paper that had been ordered, and it was completely wrong. It was like, I wouldn't describe it as brown. It's kind of ivory, and matte. It looked like low quality recycled printer paper that you would have at home. And we were just like, this isn't the right paper. And they're like, no, that's the right paper. And we were like, no, it's not the right paper. Anyway, so we've now had to go back and forth, including working out why the order, because basically the order to the printer says Thin Star Plus, but the paper is obviously not Thin Star Plus. So the paper warehouse says, well, we shipped you Thin Star Plus. And the printer says, well, this isn't Thin Star Plus. And we say it's not Thin Star Plus. So in all of that boring story, which I've now recounted, we're basically going back and forth between the printer and the paper supplier, trying to work out what to do with the 10,000 euros worth of paper that we've ordered, who is responsible for this, and how we're going to get the actual paper that we want. And so this, I would say, we plan to go to print on the 1st of March. This is recorded on Friday, the 27th of March. So you can see the effect that this has had in terms of trying to, and actually very sadly, another delay has been caused by our new print manager suffering a personal injury. He had to go to hospital for almost a week. So that also was deeply unfortunate. And, it's a little bit like, if you put these things together, it often sounds like a kind of dog ate my homework excuse, like, oh no, and then he had to go to hospital and stuff like this. But it's like, unfortunately, this is just the nature of business generally. But most of the time, there's so much at stake when you change printer because it's the core of what it is that we do. And we built in a long lead time. I mean, we started talking and securing kind of this process in December for a print job in March. So we thought we had enough time, but then right at the end, things just didn't work out as you wanted. So, there's a delay to this issue. But the advantage of this is, we spent 10 years with effectively the same print manager, Danny, and we're hopefully going to set ourselves up now for the next, we found a printer who's robust, and we hope that the next 10 years will be with one printer as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I heard you describe it, it almost feels like a reflection of the general erosion of the middle class. Like there's sort of like this middle class of print jobs is becoming harder and harder to find. And the places that used to service those middle jobs have kind of gone away. So now you just have either like extremely local small batch zine printing, or you have like mass printing. Is that sort of like a right reflection on the state of things?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to add a metaphor to that, it's also a little bit like AI coming for everyone's job in the knowledge sector, because effectively what's occurred over the last 10 years, independent magazine publishing, and I think we'll talk more about this in a minute, independent magazine publishing is up significantly. In the last 5 years, European independent magazine publishing has gone up by 12% per year in terms of sales. In terms of the number of publications, there aren't really good figures on this, but if you look at a company like Mag Culture in the UK, run by Jeremy Leslie, who is kind of like the unofficial head of independent publishing in Europe, I would say. He's a very, very important figure in this space. You look at the number of independent magazines that they sell on their website now versus how much they did in 2016 when we started Real Review, and it's about twice as many. So it's a pretty large explosion of independent magazines. A lot of those are digitally printed, so they're in 2016, digital print was really poor quality. I mean, it looked awful. You couldn't get good color. There was so much bleed. Like it looked like it had been printed on a home printer, basically. Now digital print is really quite good. A lot of the time, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I know a couple of publishers based in London who use digital printing for art books. And no, I've not ever heard anyone say like, oh, hey, is that digital printing? Doesn't look like offset litho, because the quality now is so high. So digital printing's come a long way, and that means that you can do print on demand as long as you stick within particular formats. Print on demand is now much more feasible for independent magazines. So you've basically seen the collapse of the middle section of independent media, a lot of what you might call legacy magazines and legacy publications, especially those that used to have 40,000, 30,000 circulation. A lot of those have disappeared. The independent magazine sphere is grown enormously. So overall, publishing has collapsed, basically, but that collapse is very unequal. And as you say, it's led to a situation where there's a large number of magazines now who are printing 500 copies, 1,000 copies in this sort of range, or less, 300 to 2,000, let's say. And then there's a huge gap into the next kind of tier up. So yeah, that's the kind of overall shape of and in terms of the print landscape, the effect of that is, as you say, that the middle class of printing has effectively disappeared. It's polarized. So there's a very big barrier to entry into printers who do large scale commercial jobs. I mean, one of the reasons why INI is such a good choice for us is that they specialize in pamphlet and commercial material, and they actually specialize in calendars as well. So they're almost like the type of trade publisher, because their main job is trade. Real Review is kind of one of these weird print objects that kind of slides in, because to a traditional printer, it kind of looks like a pamphlet. It looks like what they would recognize as a pamphlet. So yeah, so if I conclude there, middle of the print market has collapsed. What this means is that the independent magazines now have a lot less possibility of format exploration. So they all basically are trapped within what format you can print, either with print on demand, digital printing, or small run, or they have to be really small run. But then, the price of that just becomes very, very high. If you want to go and do something like in the UK, we have things called the newspaper club, but every European city has one of these clubs where you can go and do kind of old newsprint. The cost of that per unit is just insane. You can't really afford to do that. So yeah, that's the situation.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because it reflects also back on a question we had in the last mailbag about the importance of writing, and there was some chat about that in the group chat as well. I think, ironically, of course, in this moment, more than ever, perhaps, like printed material is quite important, just to leave something behind of the writing. Like, there's so much writing being produced. I'm sure there, just as much as there are statistics as you just quoted about certain readerships and even probably certain publications going up. Obviously, there's been a huge influx of writing online as well, but the issue there being, with it being online, it probably being less likely to be traced back in years to come. It's just much harder to hold on to great pieces of writing when they're floating around somewhere on the internet. That website might be gone in 5 years. You might not remember exactly where you read it. And the nice thing about print, as Richard Turley recently said in an interview, being like, at the very least, it creates the possibility that a later generation might dust off a magazine from under the rubble and see what was happening and decide for itself whether it meant anything at all. But then, printing becoming less viable, yeah, perfectly negates that. It's a sort of a perfect storm in a
Um,
sense.
well, listen, I mean, I'm obviously I have an investment in making a print object, and I have reasons why I like print as a format. Um, they relate, part of it relates to history, I guess, but if we were interested in making a historical document, we wouldn't print it on such light and ephemeral paper. Um, for me, Real Review is for now. Like that's its main role, is to share. It may have a historical value, but I think if you set out to create historical value, it makes you a bit pretentious, you know. I mean, well, potentially if you're too focused on making a document of record, well, anyway, listen, I actually don't want to make a judgment about that. I'm not interested in that. It will be up to the future to decide whether or not Real Review has value. What I do think is, we're concentrated on contemporary. The reason why I like print is for different reasons. One is that every issue is what I would think of as a project. So it has a clear editorial project. It's finite. There's a fixed number of pages. You have to decide what to put into it and what to leave out of it. And that means that there's a real consideration. So when you buy a magazine, you know that someone has really thought about what is in there, right? The thing about most websites is that they're effectively infinite scroll. So you can go back and edit the text afterwards. You can change its length. You can change its publication date. You can add more pieces to the website. You can remove pieces from the website. So it's very hard to establish like an editorial. There was a brief period when people were trying to produce truly like digital magazines where the website would update every 3 months, for example, and all the material would change. But this was a very short-lived period in the mid to late 2010s. Yeah, I think for me that idea of creating a coherent project in a print magazine is very important. I think there's another aspect, which is, one of the reasons why we describe ourselves as print only. We do not, I mean, you're members listening to this, so you're able to get access to the back catalog, archival copies. You're the only people who can do that. We do not publish articles on the web. We do not make that content available. If you go and ask someone like ChatGPT about Real Review, it says all sorts of amazing and fantastic things. If you ask it what's in Real Review, it can't talk to it. It doesn't know what's in it because it's not been ingested. This material sits outside of Google search engines. It sits outside of ingestion engines. And that idea of having a form of cultural discourse which is outside capitalism, outside commercialized culture, is for me really important. And this was best captured by two of our previous authors. One was many years ago. We did an interview between a woman called Stoya, who is a professional actress, adult actress, like porn star, and Annabelle Peaks, who at the time was the largest grossing what you would call webcam model. This is, of course, before OnlyFans. And the reason why we wanted them to be in conversation with each other was not because, we're interested in salacious or titillating details. It was because sex work, sex industry in general, adult entertainment industry as a whole is often a avant-garde environment for looking at the evolution of capitalism. So the reason why you can scrub through videos on YouTube is because of porn, because people don't want to wait watching bits that they don't want to watch. There's lots and lots of examples. I mean, OnlyFans really made possible like micro subscriptions. And you could go on. There's just like so many examples of the adult industry leading the charge in new monetization. And what we observed at the time was that there was a profound difference between someone who goes to set, is surrounded by lots of professional support, is a unionized worker operating in a Californian, porn shoot, versus someone who's working from their bedroom, who's building emotional connections with their quote unquote clients, who's building a fan base, who's trying to diversify their revenue streams. We saw that as very indicative of general changes in the economy in 2016. Now, Stoya agreed to do it, as did Annabelle Peaks, but Stoya was excited to do it because she said, what I like about print is there's no comment section. She was like, I get so much abuse every time I try to publish something online. It's super demoralizing and upsetting. What I like about this is the magazine exists, people can read it. I don't care what they think. They can't tell me what they think. And then the magazine like falls out of, people stop reading it and it disappears. There's no trace of it left on the internet and so on. And actually in a very different way, but this was also part of the logic of Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower involved in the WikiLeaks expose of some of the war crimes committed by America in Iraq and Afghanistan. She also, had just got out of solitary detention in the US. She'd just been pardoned, I believe, by, or had her sentence commuted, I believe, by Obama, and came to the UK for the first time. The only publications she spoke to were CNN, BBC, Guardian, and Real Review. And one of the reasons she did that was because I was attached to the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts at the time, and that she was coming there to give a speech. But she was very attracted by the fact that it was not online, that there was no trace or record. So, I mean, these are long stories, but essentially what I'm saying is I think the value of print has a lot to do with privacy, autonomy, respect for the reader, respect for the publisher. And maybe if I were to add one final aspect to it, I do think that today trust is very important because it's very hard to tell, even on a website. I mean, how many of us even actually read websites? Like, that's declining as well. Mostly it's just short form content. If the internet is just like some random person's hot take on contemporary events, what's the trust level that's involved in that? I do think that the interest in independent publishing generally, not just Real Review, but the whole landscape of independent magazines has a lot to do with people being like, I want a coherent proposition. I want to know that someone really cares about this, and cares about me as a reader. And I want to know that what I'm reading has some level of trust attached to it because they are asserting an authority in the way in which they produce this magazine. So yeah, that's it's my broader view. I mean, I do think it's interesting though that people are not going to like traditional mid-market publications. Like they've kind of collapsed. It's really like a polarization where you're either a really small niche independent magazine or you're like a national newspaper. I do find it interesting that a lot of the why are people not going and reading, an architectural magazine? Like, why would they see that? Why would they see an independent zine about architecture as being somehow better than like an established architecture magazine? Or why that, I don't
Maybe
really
the
know.
reason is those middle. I mean, I wonder. I mean, I guess it begs the question also, like, what is middle in this context? Because I'm trying to think of like something like there's the Whitney Review of Literature, which I believe is like it's more like reviewing fiction books mainly. And then there is a architectural review that kind of have a similar aesthetic.
Oh yeah. I think it's called
And
the arc. I'll find out what it's
the
called.
maybe it's the LA Review of Architecture or something like this.
No, I think it's based in New York. It's the New York Review of Architecture. It's got a kind of it's a good publication, that one actually.
Yeah, and I would say that feels middle. I guess it would depend on how much they put out, but it definitely is bigger than a zine. It's more, it's much more professionally produced as well as a zine. So there are these like, but yeah, it's not an established architecture magazine from 10 years ago. It's relatively new.
Well, I guess if we focus on that question of mid, and this is a good transition into like a list of all the things I love about I mean, you're right. There is also the Los Angeles, but it's confusing. It's called the Los Angeles. Well, it's the Los Angeles Review of Architecture, but it's the Los Angeles New York Review of Architecture because
I think they just made an issue.
an LA. They made an LA version. They've made two
Right.
LA versions, I believe.
Right. Right.
But this is like if you go back and look also at how that publication particularly has evolved. It started out as like a couple of sheets in issue 1 in 2019, and now it's up to like a proper magazine. It's like I don't know how many pages it is, but it's I think at least 64. So yeah, it's become quite over the last like 6 years. It's grown. You see its format change. It's changed format twice.
Yeah.
Or maybe 3
Even
or 4
gone
times.
into
Actually.
a skinnier Real Review-esque.
Well, there was a moment where it did resemble Real Review quite a lot, but I don't think that's because it was trying to imitate Real Review. I think that's because the reason why our magazine is that shape is because it's optimized for shipping. And so traditionally, like catalogs come in that format, which is they're roughly the same dimensions as Real Review, and they have a fold down the middle into a little plastic bag, so it can be thrown onto your doorstep by paper boys or paper girls. So I don't think they were trying to imitate Real Review. I think it's just that they converged around the particular economy of that format the way that we did. But anyway, that's a by point or side point. I think I guess if I were to kind of draw a couple of well, I like to start with some data. The first thing to say is that I'm more familiar with the European context than I am with the American context. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think some of the key figures that I would really draw out is that overall, the cost, like the circulation of independent magazines. I mean, we need to be clear what we mean by independent. Independent means that they are effectively self-owned, so they're not part of a media group. These can be very large magazines. 032C, the German culture magazine, has a circulation, I believe, of around 65 or 70,000 copies. They don't publish that figure, but I've heard that number mentioned by a number of people, and of course, I used to work there, so I think that's a realistic, 65, 70,000 at least. They're independent because they're self-owned. Fantastic Man and Gentlewoman, Woman, which are based in the UK, must have a circulation in excess of that. But they're also
based in the Netherlands, right? I believe.
Well, their publisher, their editors, Joop and Joop, are both Dutch, but it may be legally based in Netherlands. I don't know, but the offices for Fantastic Man and Gentlewoman and the production of the magazine occurs in London. But yeah, so you have, and you could even point to a magazine maybe like Apartamento, which is on the lower end of that scale. I don't know their exact circulation. I've heard that it's between 30 and 40,000. I've heard they have about 6,000 subscribers, potentially in addition to that, potentially as part of that number. But they're probably the smaller end of those larger European culture magazines. And they, nonetheless, like that's also independent. Within this landscape, we know that like there's been a huge collapse in independent publishing as a whole. So between 2016 and today, and actually you can even see it falling faster. Like in 2011, there was around $17 billion worth of sales of independent magazines across Europe. By 2016, that had been 14 billion. So that's already a fall of like 3 billion in just 3 years. Now it's around 400 million. I'm sorry, 1.4 billion. So that's a 90% reduction in the overall spend. And that's been falling at about 12% year on year for over a decade. And that's like no good, basically. And amongst independent magazines, the figures are much harder to find. I mean, I had to kind of, so I find it harder to stand by what I'm about to say, but it seems that in 2010, there was about 1.4 billion in independent magazines. It looks that it reached a real low point in about 2019 when it fell to 500 million. So it basically lost 60%. But the most recent figures show quite a significant rise in very low circulation magazines. And although it's only at 700 million now, so it's still half the overall size that it was in 2010, the distribution of that is really quite different. So I managed to find some statistics for Spain and Germany and a couple of other European countries, which basically show that it's the weekly magazines which have completely collapsed. There's like over a 50% drop in weekly magazines. Monthly magazines have also seen like a 15 to 18% drop. It's the quarterly, biannual, and annual magazines which seem to be growing. So that tells you a lot about what I was describing in terms of where the internet has taken that traffic or that attention, and where the shift in public, and also cost of publication has changed, so that the economics of like a weekly don't really make sense anymore. So I think that explains how overall the print industry is like pretty fucked.